Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ricky Bentley. I'm the program manager at the Connecticut Land Conservation Council, or CLCC. We're the umbrella organization for Connecticut's land trusts, and we support your work through policy advocacy, funding, technical assistance, and capacity building programs like this one. If you don't already, I encourage you to subscribe to our e-news. It's a great way to stay clued in on our upcoming programs. Today's presentation will present an overview of the ongoing efforts to monitor and manage lingering ash trees in the Northeast. A few quick housekeeping notes. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We'll have time for questions and answers at the end. To help preserve bandwidth, we ask that you stay muted and keep your video off until the end at the Q&A session. And we are recording. We'll share the recording with you within the next couple of days. Um, yeah, we'll be in touch. But yes, so now I'm thrilled to introduce present presenters. Goodness, Jonathan Rosenthal and Dr. Radka Wildova. They're co-directors of the Monitoring and Managing Ash program and are leading experts on invasive species with decades of experience in research, outreach, and policy. Their work focuses on forest pest impacts, invasive plants, and ecosystem health, combining science with public education and conservation strategies. Together, they bring a unique blend of ecological research and practical management experience to support forest resilience. So, join me in welcoming Jonathan and Radka. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ricky. And that was such a great introduction, and I'm happy we're recording this just so I can use that introduction in the future. It made me blush. I just want to, just as a technical issue, there was somebody who was waiting to be admitted, and I admitted them while you were introducing, and I think there were some other people waiting
Yep.
as well who are maybe being overlooked in the waiting room. So just want to let you know.
Everyone's in. Thank you.
Great. So thank you for welcoming Radka and me. And so yes, this is a presentation on the Monitoring and Managing Ash Program, acronym MAMA, and we want everyone to come to MAMA. And it's about how you can help enable lingering ash detection for resistance breeding. And the MAMA program of the Ecological Research Institute is made possible by the Tree Species in Peril initiative, which is led jointly by the U.S. Forest Service and the Nature Conservancy, with funding provided by the Nature Conservancy. And you have in the upper right of my slide the logo for the MAMA project, which gives an idea of what it's all about. There you see a single healthy ash surrounded by a lot of dead ones. And that's what we're going to be focusing on, is how do we find these so-called lingering ash and how can we use them for ash conservation and restoration. So MAMA is a program of ERI that enables detection of lingering ash. Hang on one second, please. I have to move something. A detection of lingering ash, which will be abbreviated as LA henceforth in the slides, through both data collection by natural resource professionals and community scientists, and encouraging management that facilitates lingering ash detection. As we'll discuss shortly, there are some management practices that can enable detection of these trees and some that can preclude it. So 180 lingering ash have already been detected by the MAMA project, and these are largely in New York, where the project started, with one lingering ash tree already detected in Connecticut, into which we're just at the end of last summer did we begin expanding our operations. What are lingering ash and how are they used for resistance breeding? So I'm going to give you a very technical definition of lingering ash that has a number of criteria. And it's important that this definition is very important. So I'm going to focus on that. So lingering ash are chemically untreated trees that were mature, meaning at least 4 inches diameter at breast height, during peak EAB invasion and stayed healthy for at least 2 years after EAB killed 95% of the nearby ash. So there are a lot of at leasts in there, but what this is all about is that EAB really attacks very heavily trees that are at least 4 inches in DBH. They'll attack smaller trees as well, but their main attack, they'll be really concentrating on those trees that are at least 4 inches DBH. And so we want to, as lingering ash, only find those trees that were large enough at the time of peak EAB invasion that they really attracted a lot of attention and attacks from EAB, and then proved themselves to be to have some level of resistance by not only staying alive, but remaining completely healthy and keeping that healthy crown for at least 2 years after EAB has killed at least 95% of the nearby ash. So these trees are being tested by EAB. They have been found for all three widespread northeastern ash species, white, green, and black. On the right, you see a photo that Radka took in the Hudson Valley of a lingering white ash. And the USFS, in other words, the U.S. Forest Service EAB Resistance Breeding Project, has shown that scion, which just means grafted twigs from lingering ash, can be used in selective breeding to yield highly EAB resistant trees. This is a really important thing that they found, and it provides a key to one potentially important way to maintain and restore ash populations, but it's not a largely or widely known tool. So what we're trying to do is get the word out about this tool, collecting material from from lingering ash and using them for breeding, because it ultimately depends on you as managers and as community scientists to make this happen across the range of ash in the Northeast. So a little bit more about the USFS EAB Resistance Breeding Project. So that project is based in Ohio, right near the border with Michigan, and they've been doing this work since very early on in the EAB infestation in North America. So EAB was first discovered in 2002 in Michigan. And shortly after that, the Forest Service kicked into high gear, doing lots of research. And one of their approaches was to see if they could find any trees with any heritable resistance. And the way they would do this is they had monitoring plots. They would see when the 95% mortality threshold was reached, when it had been maintained for 2 years, and then they would go out and collect scion from lingering ash, such as this tree shown here, a perfectly healthy tree with a perfectly healthy crown, and they would collect twigs off these, graft them onto susceptible native ash rootstock, and then that would yield clonal progeny from each of the lingering ash from which they collect scion. What we mean by clonal progeny is each one of these trees that's yielded by grafting on the scion from the lingering ash are genetically identical to that lingering ash. So they would do that, and then let me just go back for a moment, and then they would test the resistance of those clonal progeny by taking a pre-counted number of EAB eggs, placing them on each of these trees, and then seeing how many survived to the next larval stage and so forth, all the way to adulthood. So here are just a sample of some of their results from 2012. It shows how long they've been doing this from green ash. And if we look to the right, you see these color codings, which this is really the best. Means the eggs or newly hatched larvae are killed by the host tree. So you see, for instance, these clonal progeny from a particular lingering ash that they called Frax 10. That one, the clonal progeny from that tree were really pretty good. They were killing about a third of the larvae as soon as the eggs hatched out. See, that did about a third. This did about 25%. Then next best to that is the larvae dying in their early stages. And then the worst outcome is the larvae reaching the final stages, right? So here we see a susceptible control. In other words, this is not a lingering ash. This is just a regular ash with no signs of resistance. And you see when they put the eggs on that, basically all of them go through to adulthood. So you see that none of these are completely resistant, right? They have varying levels of resistance, but all of these lingering ash shown here have some amount of resistance. Let's look at what happens for the next generation. So then what they would do with the breeding project is they would then take a particularly once the grafted trees would reach sexual maturity and capable of reproducing, then they would take pollen from a lingering male, put it on the flower of a lingering female, and then see how their offspring turned out. In general, for resistance breeding, you're going to take the most highly resistant male and the most highly resistant female from a particular location and cross those two. But the reason that you see these two being crossed here, even though they didn't have such spectacular outcomes in terms of killing larvae, this just happened to be the first male and the first female that they were ready to breed, and they decided to give it a shot. And you see some here turn out worse than their parents, some turn out like their parents, but this bottom row is really crucial. These are the ones that turned out better than their parents. And all the way on the right, you see one that's killing, probably about 80%, something like that, of the larvae, right? So only a small percentage of those larvae are able to make it through to adulthood. So that's a really good tree. Then you take that, you do that another generation, you cross those two. And so within 2 generations, we should have restoration quality seed. And I just want to give credit because it's not, I don't know if you could see this, but this is slide and the previous one was provided by Jennifer Cook, who leads the USFS Resistance Breeding Project. And you see also a photo here that she's taken, which shows in that oval an EAB larva that was killed by a lingering ash. So obviously, if you're just killing one lingering ash larva and the rest are running rampant, that's still going to kill the tree pretty quickly. And a fully infested tree can have about 40, let's say tens of thousands of larvae in that tree. So if you can kill a very high percentage of that, the chances are you're going to be able to persist as a healthy tree. Resistance is likely needed even if biocontrol agents are established. And I mention that because I think that there are various techniques out there, and everybody hopes that each of those is a panacea. And, that's not the case. And it's certainly not the case for resistance breeding either. These are all different tools that can be used in concert with each other. So the evidence that we have that resistance breeding by itself is likely not enough is that EAB devastated green ash. Those are North American ash planted in China back in the 1990s, despite EAB's natural enemies there, because of the lack of genetic resistance. So the way things would work in nature, right? If once EAB is in a place for millennia, as it was in China, you have a highly evolved degree of resistance in the tree population coupled with those natural enemies that are present in the environment. So you have both bottom-up and top-down control of the pest. So a promising long-term approach in North America can be resistance breeding plus biocontrol. So biocontrol can help hopefully depress the populations of EAB, and then it can complement the resistance that we breed for the native ash here. So using scion for resistance breeding has advantages over using seed, because probably a lot of you have heard of seed collection and has important roles to play. But for resistance breeding, scion use has some advantages. First is that the scion from the lingering ash are genetically identical to it. In contrast, seed from lingering ash have only 50% of their genetic material from the mother tree and 50% from dad. And maybe dad is not a lingering tree, right? So here you're getting trees that should have the same performance as those lingering ash from which they're taken. Additionally, grafting of scion from mature lingering ash rapidly produces mature trees ready for breeding. So we're taking twigs off trees that are already sexually mature, that are already flowering and so forth, and you just need to wait for that new tree that's resulted from the graft to get big enough to be able to support these flowers and ultimately seed production. And that'll only take a few years rather than having to wait to grow a tree from seed. So it really accelerates the breeding program. To find lingering ash, however, what's crucial is looking at the right places at the right times. If you look in an area before that 95% mortality threshold has been reached, it will likely yield spurious lingering ash. They've not yet been attacked enough by EAB. They could be trees that EAB that where there's not even EAB yet in the area, or those particular trees have not yet been reached by EAB, or maybe EAB has just been on them, a year or two and is not showing much impact. So you need to make sure that that mortality threshold has been reached so that all those trees in that area have been thoroughly tested by EAB. Waiting too long is also a problem because first, there can be lost opportunities. Trees are likely to die from EAB because resistance is only partial. So these all the lingering ash meet the criterion of having been healthy at least 2 years after EAB has killed the rest of the trees at the site, or pretty much the rest of the trees. But in many cases, what will happen is if you wait 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road, even those trees will succumb because, as you remember, looking at those pie charts, those trees typically have only partial resistance, which is why we need to use those for resistance breeding. Additionally, ingrowth can be confused with lingering ash. So what we mean by ingrowth is trees that have reached maturity, have reached that 4-inch DBH after the EAB population has crashed. Because typically what happens is EAB will arrive in an area. The population will explode because all those trees it's encountering are naive ash. They have not encountered EAB before in an evolutionary sense. The vast majority of them, if not all of them, will be susceptible and they'll die quickly, fairly quickly, typically from EAB. And then what will happen is the EAB population crashes because there's not very much ash to sustain it. EAB never disappears in the environment because there's always enough from stump sprouts and little shoots on trees and young trees and so forth to maintain kind of an ambient level of EAB, which just waits around until there's enough new adult trees, right, to support a big EAB population again, and the EAB population will then again crest. So it's kind of like a predator-prey cycle. But if you're getting those mature trees that have just come in after the EAB population has crashed, then those trees will not have been actually tested by EAB, and these also will be spurious lingering ash. So you need to get there at the right place. There's a short window of opportunity of a few years, after that threshold has been reached to get in and find definitive lingering ash. So we've developed a tool called Mama Action Maps, and they help identify where and when to search for lingering ash so that everyone's search effort is maximized in its efficiency. You're searching in the right places at the right times. So these are initially created by ERI, that's us, Ecological Research Institute, based on EAB detection history with standard mortality trajectories and spread rates used to model where and when 95% mortality will be reached. So we're just using the detection history, which usually comes from state agencies, but it can also be data that's shared directly with us by community scientists and so forth, and also from other sources. We then, crucially, refine and update these maps very often using MAMA's ongoing data collected on actual ash health and mortality. So we start out with a model, but then we fine tune the maps based on data that people are submitting in real time in terms of mortality and health of their ash. So these show areas that should be ready to search for lingering ash based on these models and or actual recent data. And they also show areas where more data are needed and which projects to use to collect the needed data. So here's a MAMA action map of much of the range that we're now covering. So this is from it basically covers New York and New England. And so you see here in these red zones, these are areas that should be searched for lingering ash. These are areas where it's projected or known that it's been at least 8 years since EAB was first detected, and thus the predicted ash mortality is virtually 100%. So those are the areas where you really just need to be focusing for the most part on searching for lingering ash. We'll let you know how to do that. We have these green areas, which are areas that should have mortality, but we don't know if it's really going to be quite that high yet. So we have rapid ash mortality assessments, RAMAs, that can be done to get very quick assessments of the mortality. And then we have these other blue areas, which also could have high mortality. They may also not even have any mortality yet. Setting up monitoring plots in these areas and doing RAMAs can be helpful. And then we also have areas for which, for instance, I'm showing you here in New York, where there's been no EAB officially reported. But typically at this point, that's not necessarily because there's no EAB. It's because the agency has stopped tracking the spread of EAB. You'll notice in Connecticut down here that the data we have are very kind of blocky, and that's because they're on the town level, the data that we've received thus far. But we're actually about to get some much more high resolution data, and we'll be able to make a much more refined map similar to the one that we have, say, for New York. So here's the Connecticut map. As you can see, it's not that the biology of the pest is different in Connecticut. It's just that the data we have is at a coarser resolution, but we're on the verge of getting finer data. But you can see that much of the state is already at very high, projected to be a very high mortality thresholds, and we want to motivate all of you to get out there and search for lingering ash and also do these other data collection projects as appropriate, which can be setting up monitoring plots or doing RAMAs and so forth. We'll go over each of these briefly. So here are the MAMA data projects. Baseline, very easy one to do is MAMA ash EAB surveys. Quick reporting of EAB evidence, and they're important for areas where EAB has not yet been reported. So if you're located in an area for which EAB has not yet been reported, go out, take a look, see if there's definitive EAB evidence, which we provide the criteria for on our website, which I'll mention later, and mention and report to us if there is this evidence there or not there. There may be areas which EAB has not actually reached yet. MAMA Monitoring Plots Network, you monitor 40 untreated, chemically untreated mature trees annually until they're all dead. And if some are already dead from EAB when the plot is set up, that's fine. Include them because they count towards the mortality. It requires tagging the trees, and the data determines the timing of the lingering ash search of the nearby area. MAMA rapid ash mortality assessments, we're really into the acronyms, so we call those MAMA RAMAs. Those are a less precise alternative to monitoring plot establishment. They're less precise, but they're also quicker and easier to do. And you can do those on places for which you may not have permission to bang tags into trees. So it opens up a lot of opportunities for participation by citizen scientists on, for instance, public lands. But these really are reserved for sites that already have some mortality. So you're quantifying that mortality. It's a one-time search. But if, let's say, you turn up something interesting, like you're at 60% or 70% mortality this year, it can be worth going back to that same site the next year and seeing if that 95% threshold has been reached and so forth. And they're a lot quicker than monitoring plot setup. And finally, the MAMA lingering ash search. In a way, the most rewarding thing to do, which is to go out in an area of really high mortality where you think the situation is hopeless, and then actually find the lingering trees from which material can be collected, which ultimately provide a lot of hope for long-term ash conservation and restoration. So all of our data collection projects are on what's known as the Anecdata platform, which is a platform that's just dedicated to really rigorous citizen science. It's the platform that NASA uses for all of its citizen science programs, such as detecting oncoming asteroids and whatnot. So it's known to be the most reliable citizen science program or platform. However, some of our projects are also available on TreeSnap and other platforms. So you can submit data using your smartphone, using the Anecdata app on the smartphone, using a tablet, using a PC, or via email or even snail mail. And we also have printable forms that you can download from our website. You can see the link down there at the bottom of the page, and you can fill those out and mail them to us, or even better, scan them and send them in, or you can then enter the data online And so what we really want is your data, and we want to make it easy as possible for you to collect it. So here, just a very quick map showing town level map of MAMA data collection in New York and New England as of last field season, and it's going to really explode this year. We already know, for instance, in Connecticut, of lots of folks who are interested in collecting data and implementing MAMA in the Nutmeg State. So MAMA, as I mentioned, has already detected 180 lingering ash in New York and Connecticut, 179 of them in New York, one in Connecticut. That's just because our efforts, as I mentioned, are just getting underway in Connecticut. And you have all three species shown here. To collect cyan, we go out in the winter and use a big slingshot typically to collect the cyan from high up in the trees. You have to do it in the winter when the buds are dormant. The cyan were grafted, and here we see at Cornell University, these are cyan that were grafted by another partner of ours, Coldwater Pond. That's a private company that are absolute experts at tree grafting. So they grafted the cyan, and these are now being raised at Cornell and will be used for resistance breeding. And our partner at Cornell told us that some of these trees are now over 7 feet tall. So they're doing really well. And the graft take rate was over 95%. So almost all the cyan we're collecting are successfully being grafted, which is remarkable. Here's a lingering white ash. This is the lingering tree in Kent, Connecticut, which a arborist, landscaper, really wonderful person reported to us, and we went out with him and collected cyan, and that cyan from this tree were successfully grafted and are now being raised at Cornell. Here's a lingering black ash over 20.5-inch DBH. And that's at a site in the Hudson Valley that first had signs of EAB in 2014. So to date, very few lingering black ash have been found, and that's largely, well, they're probably quite uncommon, but also they largely have not been looked for. So to find them, you have to look for them. So how can managers enable lingering ash detection? One thing is MAMA data collection, because I know that probably quite a few of you are affiliated with land trusts, so you are involved in land management, as are other folks. So how can you become involved? One thing is the MAMA data collection that I mentioned. So you can establish a monitoring plot, 40 mature trees, but you have to commit to not cutting or treating the trees until they're dead. Ramas are efficient for high mortality areas. They also require 40 trees, but they don't have to be tagged. You're not committing to also revisiting them. Searching for lingering ash, which again, a lot of folks should be able to do this in Connecticut if mortality is sufficiently high. And then finally, those ash EAB surveys in those rare areas in Connecticut for which EAB has not yet been reported. What are other ways? Incorporating into the cutting and treatment plans. So in general, aside from even setting up a monitoring plot, just leaving enough standing healthy ash uncut and untreated for possibility of some eventually manifesting as lingering ash. There has been a lot of advice out there over the years that you should, EAB is coming quick, just cut down all your ash, or you're going to lose all that timber value. The problem is if you cut down all your ash, you'll never know if any of those would have ultimately turned out to be lingering ash, which can provide the hope for the long-term conservation and restoration of the species. So it doesn't mean you have to leave every tree standing. There are really good reasons to cut trees, including if they're going to be hazard trees or if you have to harvest some for economic reasons or other good reasons. But collectively, across the landscape, if we all leave some trees that we're neither treating nor cutting, as long as they're healthy, then we know those trees may, among them, have lingering ash. And what you can do is, as those trees start to decline, if you want to, if you have compelling reasons to cut them, you can also cut those trees. So I had an odd order also setting the 40 trees aside for a monitoring plot that I already mentioned. And trees that are not in a monitoring plot, as I mentioned, can be cut as soon as they begin to decline. When most ash are dead or in severe decline, in other words, let's say even before you've gotten to that 95% mortality threshold, let's say you're at 50% mortality And 50, maybe of the tree, 50% of the trees that are alive, maybe 25% of them are in really bad shape and 25% are in pretty good shape. Those 25% are revealing themselves of healthy trees are revealing themselves as potential lingering ash. So we ask that once you've gotten to that situation, to please, if possible, refrain from cutting those remaining healthy trees when it, like kind of a small subset of them has emerged, because among those are likely or possibly going to be some actual lingering ash. So monitoring plots, in addition to letting us know where and when to search for lingering ash, they can also inform management. Plots often reveal often reveal that mortality is overestimated and or wrongly attributed to EAB. So typically, folks have an emotional response to EAB, where as soon as trees start dying off, they get to this dark emotional place of all our trees are dead. And what we find is when then we go, or the managers go and set up a monitoring plot, often they will find that in fact the mortality is actually only 50 or 60 or 70%. It's not 100% or anything close to it. So why is this important? Because your management responses can be, the timeline of your management responses can be adjusted accordingly. If, for instance, you want to replace dead trees with other trees to fill in forest gaps and so forth, and you think you're going to have to do it all immediately, that may not be the case. So your management timeline can be recalibrated. And what we found actually is that there's tremendous variation in mortality trajectories, which can in turn affect management timelines. So here, just looking at some of our monitoring plots for white ash, we see that some are projected to reach or have reached 100% mortality in as little as 4 years, but some are not going to reach that until maybe 8 years. And this is there's other data that also show from other sources that show similar results. So it also means that idea of EAB is on your threshold, all your ash are going to be dead within 2 or 3 or 4 years or whatever, is not necessarily the case. And so from monitoring, you can find out really what's happening for your ash. We've also found that often people have reported that all their ash, or a lot of them, have been killed by EAB. And when we dive deeper into the data, there's actually no evidence of EAB at the site, and they've been killed by something else, such as ash yellows. So doing the in-depth data collection that's required for a plot gets you to much more informed about what's going on with your ash. So what do you do if you find lingering ash? Once found, report them on the Mama Lingering Ash Search Project. That way we know of their existence and we can prioritize. We generally have more lingering ash than we have capabilities to collect scion, or to grow out scion. So we'll prioritize the most promising trees. But once we find out about them, then we can put them in our prioritization spreadsheet and, if appropriate, arrange for collection of scion and use them for resistance breeding. Protect from cutting at least until after the scion are collected, right? So these are such important trees. You don't want to cut them down. You want to make, if you're not the landowner or land manager, you want to make them aware of these trees and make sure they're not cut. Once reported and verified, you can then chemically treat them to prolong the health, right? If you've treated them before they've been determined to be a lingering ash, then we'll never know if they're truly lingering ash or if their healthy persistence was just enabled by the chemical treatment. But once they've been identified as lingering ash, you can chemically treat them because, again, typically they're only partially resistant. It can, in some cases, make sense. In some cases, it may not. But if you have a lingering tree, we can discuss whether or not you want to go ahead and treat that tree. You can also target lingering ash for seed or pollen collection that can also be used for resistance breeding. So if it's a male tree, pollen collection, female tree, seed collection. And for more information on MAMA, I know I've raced through things pretty quickly. You should visit the MAMA website, which is www.monitoringash.org. We're in the process of updating that website right now. We've kind of been overtaken by lots of progress, and so some aspects are quite out of date, but we also have some really valuable tools there, including some training materials, including on ash identification and other pieces of knowledge and also our data sheets and other information. You can email either of us directly also. Here are our emails. So with that, I'll conclude the slide portion of this presentation. Thank you all. And I am not hearing or seeing anyone, so I don't know.
So right now there are no questions in the chat. So if people wanted to ask questions, you can place them in the chat or just raise your hand.
Jonathan, that was great. We really appreciate you sharing. I was wondering, do you have any more information about how you think the majority of the trees that are resistant are controlling the pest? Is it mostly chemical or physical or?
Right. So you touched on two things there. So one, I could let's see, I could go back. Let me go back to the slide. Hang on a second, if I can figure out how to do this. I'm going to try and go back to a slide that we had earlier, and let's see, go back to the share. I don't know. That doesn't seem to be cooperating. But if you remember, there was an image of an EAB larva that was calloused in, that had been killed by the tree. So one possibility is that the trees can grow callus tissue rapidly around the EAB larvae and entomb them. But one thing that we do know is that one difference that has emerged from the lingering trees is that they have some higher concentrations of secondary defensive chemicals than susceptible trees. And so it seems that, this chemistry is likely playing a role, and but it may be that that's in combination with a physical response, and that maybe the larvae are first being kind of slowed before they're being entombed, or they're already dead when the tissue is grown around them. That's something that I've been meaning to reach out to some of our research colleagues and find out if they have a better handle on that. It's also possible that some trees are less attractive or potentially even repellent to the pest. I'm just kind of spitballing this, that it's possible, and that if you looked at those tests that were being done, where they were placing the EAB larvae on the trees, on the clonal progeny, and seeing how successful the eggs and the larvae were, they were actually doing a very conservative estimate of resistance, right? Because if the trees are surviving and thriving because they're not attractive to EAB, then in nature, those trees would never even have had the eggs placed on them. So we're actually getting a very conservative estimate. We're just getting a handle on those mechanisms that would be affecting the eggs and the larvae post egg deposition.
Interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions?
There's a question. How does the EAB move from one forest to another?
So EAB are really good flyers. And we know this because, believe it or not, early on in the invasion in North America, folks wanted to answer that question of how far can they spread on their own without being transported by humans, which I'll get to in a moment. So one way they can do it is they are actually very powerful flyers. They can even fly 10 or more miles in their lifespan. And the way that this is known is that researchers actually made little wind tunnels where they would take an individual EAB one at a time and tether it, and then blow wind against it and watch the EAB the adults are capable of flight, fly against the wind in the wind tunnel. And they could, from how long that it was doing that, they could calculate how many miles that would translate into. It's kind of like swimming in an endless pool or running on a treadmill. So they are quite capable of moving on their own. They can also be moved in firewood. So it's a reason the larvae or the eggs can be moved along with firewood. And it's yet another reason not to move firewood. And I'll mention that a lot of other pests, including even gypsy moths, are moved around on firewood. And EAB is also really, really good at hitching rides on vehicles. And in fact, the number one predictor of where EAB are going to spread to next is the proximity of a road and how much traffic volume there is on that road. And just another study that demonstrated the importance of this method of moving is that in Russia, where for some reason, I don't know why this is the case, firewood it does not get moved. I don't know if it's punishable by death or what the reason is. There you have the same pattern of EAB spreading along major roadways with major traffic. So there's probably nothing you can do about that. You know, you may want to check and see if there are any EAB hitching on your windshield wipers, just as you should for a spotted lanternfly as well. But so don't move firewood. But even if you don't move it, the EAB are still capable of moving either through their own flight or through hitching on vehicles.
There's a forest management question.
Sure.
I am new to working with the Branford Land Trust in our forests. I'm not aware of any adult ash stands, but we have some seedlings and saplings of green ash trees. What should we do with those immature trees?
That's a great question. And could I ask a question to the questioner, which is, am I correct in assuming that you had adults and all those, or mature trees and all those mature trees were killed off by EAB? Or I'm just trying to picture the whole situation there. Is it so obviously there's some seed source for these seedlings and saplings. So is it that there had been live mature trees there? Is there an answer?
Somehow I got off of the Zoom. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, great. So I am not aware of any large ash trees. That may be my ignorance or my naivety, but I have not seen them. So I don't
Right.
know. There's somebody else on the Zoom meeting today, Lauren, who might know. She's been involved with the land trust much longer than I am. Lauren, are you there?
Doesn't seem to be there.
So I do not.
Yeah. So I'll just answer the question. It sounds like an unknown, but here's what I think. I think that there's no reason to remove them.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, the longer that so one problem that can happen when you have mature ash that are killed by EAB is that it can open considerable canopy gaps, right? Depending on how large the trees are and how many of the trees there are and what percentage they are of they form of the forest canopy. And one thing that's been found is that the longer the young trees, the seedlings and stuff persist under that tree, even once the mature tree is dead, they can provide enough shade to the ground under that where the tree had been, that they inhibit invasive species proliferation. Because one of the big problems that you can have is canopy gaps opening, more sunlight reaching the ground, and then invasive plants exploding. So for that reason alone, it's great to let those trees persist, as long as they can persist, because they'll shade the ground and inhibit invasive plant establishment. Another thing is that although chances are probably, over 90% or over 95% that all these trees are susceptible and not actually lingering trees, just if they're from, seed that was randomly deposited there. The trees are likely to persist for a while at least if EAB populations have already crashed there. And then what you could do is at that point, set up a monitoring plot once these trees are 4 inches or more or whatnot and see, or just track the trees in general and see if any of them turn out to be lingering ash. Or, once they're mature, you could potentially do other things to help some of them to persist, such as inject them. And the other thing can be, a possibility is parasitoid establishment. And so parasitoids are increasingly getting established across the landscape based on being released from lots of different points. And some of them, kind of the jury is out as to how effective these are, some probably more than others, and some particularly effective on younger trees and not older trees and so forth. But they do seem to be getting established. So the combination of, if EAB again has already swept through and the population has crashed, if you're having low EAB numbers and established parasitoid numbers together, that can, and younger trees that don't support EAB very well, that could enable these young, I think you said green ash or green and white ash, to persist for a while and then take it from there. That would be my suggestion. Hopefully, quite a few of them will make it to maturity, and then we'll see what happens. But there'd be no reason to remove them.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
There was another question about movement of EAB through logging, and I think that's a very good point, especially if the trees are logged before you even know that the trees maybe have EAB, and then they can definitely exit the trees. So I assume that logging can be a good way to move the EAB around to new places. And there's
Yes. Yeah, and I just want to, you're right. And the thing is that, EAB are only found in live trees, right? So if these are live trees they're cutting down, it's very possible there are EAB larvae in them, and they can, come out. They can mature potentially, and the adults, if they're ready to go, can come out. I don't know the extent to which there's a quarantine in place in Connecticut. I know there was a quarantine in New York, and that's been lifted. Some states have them, some don't. That's what that was meant to control. Typically, states, when they get to the point where they think that EAB is everywhere, they'll lift the quarantine. And it's unfortunate because even if a EAB is maybe across the state as a whole on a gross scale, there are likely to be pockets that it hasn't yet reached, and hopefully, logs containing EAB are not moved to those uninfested pockets.
Another question. I manage just over 3,000 acres and almost 50 miles of trails in Washington, Connecticut, and we are constantly clearing dead ash from the trails. I haven't seen a living ash in the 3 years that I have been working here. Are there any cases where lingering ash has been found in areas with such high mortality? And we are definitely finding the lingering trees in places with this really high mortality, but it can be a combination of, because as Jonathan showed you, that the resistance of these trees are not 100%. So if the trees have some resistance and are growing in more stressful conditions, they may not even survive that long as the other trees and as the susceptible trees. And also, if you are in area where you have higher levels of the parasitoids, again, they can help the reveal the lingering trees in these areas. So definitely it's worth it always to search areas that have really high mortality. And that's what is this all about.
Yeah, I completely agree with Radka. I mean, the whole thing is that so I'm wondering, when that that really high mortality was reached in the acres that you manage, because if, let's say, if that 100% mortality was reached, 5 years ago or something like that, it's very possible that there were lingering ash that would have been detected 2 years after that threshold was reached, but they can now no longer be detected, or last year's or the year before, because they already succumbed. But two more things. Yeah, as Radka said, it's in the areas with really high mortality. That's the only areas you're going to find lingering ash. But the key to it is you have to be searching for them. So a quick story: a few years ago, we wanted to do a workshop at Cornell Cooperative Extension, Ulster County, which is in the Kingston, New York area. And the folks who ran that said there's no point to doing that. All the ash are dead. And also everybody knows everything about EAB already, and there's no point to having your webinar. And we said, well, we have this very different approach, because our approach is targeted to those areas where, quote, all the ash are dead, or almost all the ash are dead, because we really need to have people looking in those areas for the lingering trees. So we got word out about it, and how we have this approach where it takes those really hopeless areas and gives you something hopeful to do, not just for the sake of doing something, but because it actually turns up these lingering trees. And our workshop was really well attended, and that's the area, that area of the Hudson Valley here in New York, where we have turned up the vast majority of our lingering trees. So I don't know. I'd love to have a further conversation with you, the person who posted that last question, about the extent to which you think you've really or which you actually have really gone through all the acreage and all the trees, because if you have the impression that they're all dead and you haven't really systematically searched through all the areas, you may be overlooking some trees. But the other possibility, as you mentioned, is there may have been lingering ash that have since succumbed, which highlights the importance of getting in there, right when the mortality threshold is reached, or within a couple of years after that, so that you can find those trees before they succumb. But I'd love to talk anybody who's managing land and so forth. We'd love to follow up with more conversations about this and see how we can work together.
There is another question, kind of more general, again about forest management. I'm wondering whether the advice not to cut down ash prematurely extends to other tree species facing infestations. Is that something you can speak to?
Yeah, I can speak to it. So we particular, the ERI, is now working on. We work with ash. We've been doing this since the MAMA program since 2017. There's a similar program modeled after it that's looking for lingering hemlock, and which we're also involved in. And both of these, both ash and hemlock, resistance breeding and lingering ash searches or lingering tree searches fall under the umbrella of the Tree Species in Peril initiative that I mentioned before. Similar approaches are being taken to beech and have also been taken to elm. Regarding proactive cutting in general, if the reason that you're cutting is to avoid a pest or to inhibit pest establishment or spread, that may or may not make sense. In some cases, you may be able to inhibit the spread of some species of pests on some species by cutting the trees down. So for instance, with Asian longhorn beetle, the approach that has been taken and has been largely successful is not only cutting down the tree that has the Asian longhorn beetle, but cutting the trees within a certain radius of infested trees. And that's really worked. Quite a few localized infestations have been completely wiped out using this technique. So it really, I think, depends on the pest. Also, with Asian longhorn beetle, it does not spread spontaneously. It's a very weak flyer, and it'll just kind of fly to the next tree. It doesn't spread quite as rapidly. It's other than being spread by people. So in that case, if you're cutting down the trees around an infested tree, that can really inhibit its spread. For emerald ash borer, it has the opposite effect because emerald ash borer are directed flyers, and they'll fly to the nearest ash, but they can fly very far. So if you're cutting down the nearby ash trees, it actually increases their spread rate. They'll actually spread faster because they'll just, instead of having to go 1 or 2 miles, they'll go 4 or 5 miles, to the next ash stand. So I would say it would be species specific. Yeah, in some cases it may be helpful to proactively cut trees. I don't really want to go beyond that.
I think we should at this point mention the possibility of field workshops in Connecticut.
Thank you. Yes, we're on the verge of scheduling one, if not two, workshops that would happen sometime in July in Connecticut. Ideally, we'll do one in the western portion of the state and one in the eastern portion of the state. And for that training workshop, what we would do is just have a very quick summary of what you've seen today, just a couple of slides on that. It would not be repeated. And then some additional information that you need in a field context on identifying ash, identifying EAB evidence, some things like that. And then we'll head out into the field and demonstrate how to collect data for all 4 projects, which would include setting up a monitoring plot. We'll actually involve you in the setting up of a monitoring plot, as well as collecting data for ARAMA, the Rapid Ash Mortality Assessment, looking for lingering ash, and also just documenting EAB presence. So people, I think, really get a lot out of these hands-on workshops, and it's worth coming to either if you want to do the citizen science aspect of MAMA, or if you want to learn how to integrate it into management and how to enable detection of lingering trees through management. So you get to see how, it's very different instead of enduring a slideshow to be out there hands-on ash. And one thing that we found is that a lot of folks who have come to our workshops previously thought they were really good at identifying EAB evidence, definitive evidence, and so forth. And it can be quite subtle. There are, for instance, native ash borers that leave trails that are different, but somewhat similar to EAB galleries under the bark. And so we will go into how to differentiate these and so forth. So I think everybody, even if you already have experience with this, comes out learning something from these. Well, we'll let you know. And maybe Ricky, if you could jump in on this, if you could, when we have the places and dates nailed down, which should happen quite soon, if you would be able to publicize those workshops.
Yeah, absolutely. Once we have the dates and places set, everyone that attended this workshop, just stay tuned. We'll send out a notification on that and do some further outreach. But yeah, I think just for the sake of time, I'd like to thank Jonathan and Radka for the presentation today. Thank you all for joining us. I greatly appreciate it.